Thank you so much, David. And thank you all. I'm so thrilled to be here. Today's talk is a topic which I'm very passionate about. And so I'm just going to dive right in. And as David said, feel free to ask questions along the way. We'll probably save most of them to the end, but hopefully we can have a nice, lively discussion at the end. So I'm going to share my screen. Please, someone confirm that you can indeed see my screen.
We can, and yep, perfect.
Great. And everyone can hear me okay, I'm assuming.
Correct.
Great. Alrighty, so again, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Today we'll be talking about big philanthropy, perpetuating inequitable systems and the concentration of power. So lots to cover today. I'm going to try to get through it all. So I'd like to start off with a quote by Robert Reich, who is a professor of public policy at Berkeley and was also in the Clinton administration. You may have seen some of his posts. He's very prolific on social media, and he's a big proponent of kind of changing the way that big philanthropy works. So Robert Reich said, big philanthropy is definitionally a plutocratic voice in our democracy, an exercise of power by the wealthy that is unaccountable, non-transparent, donor-directed, perpetual, and tax-subsidized. So lots of big words, lots of big concepts. We're going to try to dive into some of these concepts throughout the presentation. And I just like to note that this is a photo of John D. Rockefeller and his son. And the reason that I've included this photo is because we're going to talk also about the history of big philanthropy, and Rockefeller was obviously a big part of that. Before I dive into the meat of the session, I would like to do a little bit more of an introduction around myself and my organization, Women Unite. So who am I? My name, as David mentioned, is Tara Ebrahimi. I am the Director of Communications for an organization called Women Unite, which is based here in Chicago. So who is Women Unite? What does the organization do? We are a women-operated nonprofit, and we provide high-quality consulting services. So to go a little bit deeper, our model is very unique and I think quite innovative. We provide grant management, grant writing, marketing, communications, graphic design, training and facilitation, and most recently, we've been doing equity audits as well of organizations. So we provide those services to 3 partner organizations each year. And what's unique about this is that we provide those services for free to these 3 partnering organizations. And we subsidize that work by providing those same services on a sliding scale to paying nonprofit clients. So this model allows us to provide these capacity building services to grassroots organizations here in Chicago who are doing amazing work, but might not have the time or resources to do some of the necessary work that goes along with running a nonprofit and providing direct services. So I would be remiss if I did not mention our partners this year. And remember, these are the organizations that we provide the services to for free. We are working with an organization called Healing to Action, which does survivor-led organizing around gender justice and gender-based violence. Growing Home, which some of you may know, it's an urban farm in Englewood, which also provides workforce development and just serves the primarily Black low-income community of Englewood. And then the Chicago Women's Health Center, which provides access to healthcare for the LGBTQ community and low-income individuals, and they provide their services also on a sliding scale fee. And then some of the clients that we work with are iGrow Chicago, which is also based in Englewood and provides kind of direct services to, again, the primarily Black low-income community of Englewood. Chicago Voyagers is another one, and they offer outdoor experiential learning and wilderness trips to low-income youth all across Chicagoland. And another one that I'd like to highlight is the Resurrection Project, which is a 30-year-old organization, and they do community wealth building, and they're based in Pilsen, although their work is also all over Chicago. So despite COVID, we have had a very successful year. Um, we were able to raise and then distribute almost $30,000 to our partnering organizations. And we did this through individual fundraising campaigns and virtual events. We also were able to raise approximately $1.7 million in grant awards for our clients and our partners through grant writing and grant management services. We also provided 429 hours of free services to our partners and then 3,000 hours of services to our clients on a sliding scale fee. So the reason that I bring this up is more than just tooting our own horn, although I am very proud of the work that we did this year. But I bring this up because it ties to the conversation that I'm about to launch into, which is around big philanthropy. So we are a very small grassroots organization. We've only been around a few years. And we have managed to have all these wonderful achievements and accomplishments. And we've done it because of the individual donor support that we've received. So this is going to come into play a little bit later in the presentation, but I wanted to sort of demonstrate before we got into the meat of the presentation what the collective donors can do. So this stands in contrast to what big philanthropy really is. All right, so let's kind of get into this. So this is the roadmap for today's presentation. And I thought it was important to sort of create a bit of a roadmap and set some objectives for what I hope to accomplish with today's presentation and what I hope you'll take away from this. We're going to start off with just defining some terms and concepts, because I know there's a lot of sort of industry type terms and ideas that I'm going to be throwing at you that you might not be familiar with. So I wanted to level set a bit with that. We will talk a little bit about the history of big philanthropy, although there is much, much more than what I can cover in today's presentation. And that'll sort of segue into what the problem is with big philanthropy. So then we'll kind of switch gears and talk about the other side of the coin, which is the nonprofit industrial complex, which, don't worry, I will define that. And then that'll sort of lead into why aren't nonprofits working. Finally, we'll kind of talk a little bit about what can we as the individuals do to sort of mitigate some of these issues and challenge these systemic inequities that we are seeing in big philanthropy and the nonprofit industrial complex. And then we'll close out with questions, comments, hopefully a bit of a discussion. All right, so terms and concepts. So big philanthropy, this is obviously, in the title of the presentation, it is, one of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So what is big philanthropy? So big philanthropy is not the ordinary small donations that you or I make, but it's essentially the wealthy elite, the powerful, exercising their power through donations. So sometimes it's as bad as a naked aspiration to change public policy to kind of set their own agenda. But other times it can be, rooted in good intentions, but those good intentions aren't always necessarily resulting in the best outcomes. So a foundation, I'm sure most of you know what a foundation is, but I wanted to delineate between a foundation and a nonprofit because it can get a little bit confusing, because both foundations and nonprofits are technically not-for-profit entities based on the US tax code. But a foundation is, of course, the entity that distributes money, although they can also be on the receiving end of funds as well. So like a good example of that would be United Way. People can donate to United Way, but then United Way also distributes funds to other nonprofit organizations. A nonprofit, in the way that I mean it for this presentation, is an organization that's providing some kind of direct services, dealing with some sort of social issue, helping individuals who are in need or communities that are underserved. And then the nonprofit industrial complex. This is a slightly complicated term to understand, but this is essentially a system of relationships between the wealthy, foundations, nonprofits or non-government organizations, and social justice organizations that really results in controlling the social justice movement, perpetuating some of these inequities and systemic oppressions that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And what's really important to keep in mind is that the nonprofit industrial complex really exists because of our capitalist framework. So, it mirrors a lot of the for-profit sector in that, like I said, it's rooted in capitalism. And it encourages social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than challenging those structures or trying to work outside of those structures. In fact, working outside of those structures is nearly impossible, as it is quite impossible in our country to work outside of a capitalist framework. Corporate giving is exactly what it sounds like when corporations have sort of a fund disbursement arm. So, the AT&T Foundation or the Bank of America Foundation. And then individual giving for the purposes of this presentation is what I refer to when I speak about donors like you and I giving sort of, $50 to our favorite nonprofit or $100 to, a grassroots organization in Chicago. So it's the everyday Joe who, gives part of their income to a charity. All right, so history of big philanthropy. So big philanthropy is actually rooted in British poor laws, and British poor laws essentially gave the government the power to raise taxes to provide relief to the disadvantaged, the aged, and the handicapped. So this made its way, of course, into American Puritanism, where churches raised money to care for the poor and destitute. So I want to make a distinction here between the worthy poor, and I put that in quotes, and the quote unquote unworthy poor. So in the roots of this philanthropy, this charity, there was the worthy poor, which was generally white individuals, those who practiced the same religion. Christianity. And then there's the unworthy poor, which were people of color, communities of color, people who had different religious beliefs. So this distinction still persists today. And I think that's a really important point to kind of keep in mind throughout this presentation, because, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but these perspectives have really kind of underscored philanthropy and charity as we know it today. And it's something we need to buck against and try to challenge, because there is no worthy poor. There is no unworthy poor. I mean, if you have needs, then, those needs ought to be met regardless of your religious beliefs, your race, your ethnicity, what have you. Alrighty, so big philanthropy as we know it was essentially born during the industrial revolutions of the late 1700s and early 1900s. Of course, these were based on theories and ideas that were driven primarily by white men, as most things were in that era. So a perfect example of this is the Gospel of Wealth. And for those of you who don't know, the Gospel of Wealth was written by Andrew Carnegie, and it is essentially a treatise that called upon millionaires to distribute their wealth for the public good. And this really was kind of the basis of like foundations as we know them today. So again, modern grant making was founded on these large scale donations from families or individuals who made their wealth off of steel, oil, railroad, all of those things. And so we're talking about your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, and others from that era. So the growth of charitable giving really occurred in the 20th century, and it started really with World War I, where Americans gave more than $400 million in gifts. And this signaled the growth of this industry. The 20th century saw the unfolding of the foundation movement, and a lot of this was based on tax legislation. So there was a really important bill in 1917 around tax deductions for nonprofits, for charities. I'll come back to the GI Bill in a moment, but and then there was the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which had a lot of stipulations in it around charitable giving. So the reason that I put the GI Bill in here is because this is really a good example of the systems of oppression and inequity that still persist today. 0.1% to 2% of federal housing authority loans went to communities of color, regardless of military status. So this is really important because it underscores everything that is still occurring today in the nonprofit realm. And we'll kind of come back to this in a couple of slides where I talk about how foundation funds are distributed today. You'll see that there's a great parallel between how, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and what's occurring today. Another really important point that I want to make is that the rise in the nonprofit industry and nonprofit organizations aligns very closely with the cutting of social service programs. So the social safety net, which is basically a term that encompasses the services that the government is supposed to provide to kind of keep people afloat, to provide services that are necessary to ensuring a middle class, to ensuring that the gap between the wealthy and the poor does not widen too much, and just providing education and other social services. The social safety net is really suffering, and is I'm sure, with everything going on with COVID, you all have noticed and recognized that the system is fairly broken right now, and nonprofits can't do the work that the government should really be doing for individuals who are underserved, who are lower income. So I want you all to kind of keep this in mind as well throughout the rest of the presentation, because in an ideal world, nonprofits wouldn't even have to exist. And the reason that there are so many nonprofits is because our capitalist system is really not working. All right, so the problem with big philanthropy. I'd like to start off with a quote by Edgar Villanueva, who wrote a fantastic book called Decolonizing Wealth, which I highly recommend. The basis of traditional philanthropy is to preserve wealth, and all too often that wealth is fundamentally money that's been twice stolen, once through the colonial style exploitation of natural resources and cheap labor, and the second time through tax evasion. So I'll let this sink in for a moment. And then another quote that I'd like to share is again by Robert Reich, who I started off the presentation with. Big philanthropy is an exercise of power, and in a democracy, any form of concentrated power deserves scrutiny, not gratitude. So I want to take a moment to kind of dissect these quotes. The first one essentially is talking about, again, going back to the roots of philanthropy. So, these oil barons, these steel barons, they exploited natural resources and cheap labor to accumulate this massive amount of wealth. And then with the introduction of these tax incentives that I'm going to dive into a little bit later, they essentially were able to exploit all over again. So this is clearly a system that is not an equitable system. It's a system that doesn't work for the everyman. It's a system that works for the 1%. And then with the second quote, you'll notice that I have these photos of some of the wealthiest men in the world: Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Bloomberg. I want you all to kind of think about how you view philanthropic gifts from the very wealthy and the elite. We can't really take these gifts at face value, because as I've sort of been talking through this presentation, there are often strings attached with these gifts. That's the first thing. The second thing is these wealthy individuals aren't doing this necessarily out of the goodness of their heart. Not that, I certainly don't know what their inner feelings and emotions are. So I'm not suggesting that there aren't some good intentions behind these gifts, but there are major tax incentives. There's major power that comes along with making donations of, hundreds of millions of dollars or what have you, to nonprofits. And we're going to talk about those strings when we kind of switch gears and talk about the nonprofit industrial complex. So who decides funding? Well, it's people like Bezos, Bloomberg, Zuckerberg. 92% of foundation CEOs are white. 89% of foundation boards are white. So, there's a common theme running there. White men are often the ones who decide funding. And it's really important to keep this in mind, because there is this idea that, which I'm going to talk about again in a little bit, that white wealthy men are no better than the people who are on the ground or the communities who are, receiving services. So this is a myth that needs to be debunked at every turn, because it's the individuals and the communities and the organizations who are doing the work that really are the ones that should be making the decisions and knowing where funds should go to really do the most good and make the most impact. So yeah, all right, moving on. So where does funding go? So less than 10% of funding makes it to communities of color. 12% goes to human services. 31% goes to religious organizations. So, your churches. And then most major individual donations from, the super wealthy individuals goes to universities, hospitals, cultural institutions, and they're often for highly visible capital projects. So like buildings, facilities, complexes, things like that. You'll notice here that I have a photo of the dedication of the George Hollis Jr. Sports Center, which is part of Loyola's campus. And this was named for Chicago Bears owner George Hollis Jr. And I have a photo of him right there. So, again, this ties back to this idea that you have an immense amount of power when you give to certain organizations and when you kind of control the purse strings. The other thing that I wanted to mention is this note about 12% of funding going to human services. We're going to break this down a little bit more, but very little funding goes to organizing, advocacy, and systemic change work. So what I mean by this is that organizations that are working to challenge some of the existing systems that we function under, they don't receive a lot of funding. So this again perpetuates this need for charity, this need for nonprofits. It's sort of that give a man a fish kind of idea, where we really should be empowering individuals and communities to, make systemic and institutional change, but rather we're just sort of, feeding the hungry, or, providing these direct services. So like I mentioned earlier, much of the incentive behind philanthropy is preserving the wealth of these wealthy individuals and these corporations or foundations. So John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, said a certain amount of corporate philanthropy is simply good business and works for the long-term benefit of the investors. Mackey sold Whole Foods to Amazon, as you all probably know, for nearly $14 billion. Between 2006 to 2020, Whole Foods has donated 0.62% of their hundreds of billions of dollars in total assets. Just for comparison's sake, on average, Americans donate 2.1% of their disposable income to charity. So you'll notice there's a huge discrepancy there. Of course, 0.62% of 14 billion is a much bigger number than 2.1% of, $50,000 or $60,000. But still, the ratios are kind of alarming. Further, for every dollar a billionaire donates to charity, we, the people, chip in anywhere from 37 to 57 cents in the form of tax revenue. Like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these really sort of specific tax incentives that the wealthy are benefiting from. But I mean, when I saw that statistic, I was shocked and very dismayed, as I'm sure many of you are. Okay, so just to get a little wonky here for a moment, I wanted to discuss two specific tax incentives that benefit the wealthy. So there is something called donor advised funds. And these are holding accounts that donors can put money into and then parcel out to charities from those accounts. So donors get a tax break on the amount that they put into a DAF, but not the amount that gets distributed to nonprofits or charities. Additionally, there is no legal requirement for DAFs to pay out their funds to charities ever. So those funds can stay in that DAF forever and ever. People are really starting to use these donor advised funds to their advantage. As I note, donations to DAFs have increased by 66% over 5 years, which is a tremendous amount. An example of this is GoPro, those little cameras that you, I think, wear on your head. So Nicholas Woodman donated $500 million worth of stock to a DAF. The value of the company went down, which naturally means that the stock went down. However, he got the full $500 million tax break. So you'll see how the system is really designed to keep power and wealth in the hands of the people who are already wealthy and powerful. And then there's another tax incentive called the carried interest loophole. The carried interest loophole is a share of private equity or a fund's profits that serve as a compensation for fund managers. So because this compensation is not considered income, it's taxed at a much lower rate. So again, this is a way to kind of get around some of these tax issues and to again benefit people who know how to exploit these systems and work them to their advantage. So a big proponent of the carried interest loophole is Robert Smith, this was a pretty big news story, so you may recall this, but he pledged to give a ton of money to Morehouse College and wipe out student debt for everyone in the graduating class of 2019. So the reason that I bring this up is because, he's able to do this because of things like the carried interest loophole. And further, this example also underscores the idea that if the government was functioning the way that it should in an ideal world, we wouldn't even need individuals like Robert Smith to wipe out student debt for the class of 2019, because student debt shouldn't even exist in the way that it does today. I mean, a lot of times when I work with nonprofit organizations, when we ask them the question, what is your ultimate goal? Their response is, well, I don't want to have to exist because I don't want this issue. I don't want what we're doing to be an issue any longer. I don't want it to be a social cause. Like, this should be already taken care of. So again, this goes back to this idea of, great, it's a wonderful thing that he did, but how was he able to do this? Well, because he's able to, sort of exploit the tax system. And B, he shouldn't have to do this. This shouldn't even be something that has to happen. All right, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about the flip side of things, which is the nonprofit landscape. So I defined the nonprofit industrial complex a little earlier, but again, just to kind of remind people, it is the system of the wealthy, foundations, nonprofit and non-government organizations, and how these entities all kind of work together to perpetuate systems of oppression and systems of inequity, and how the nonprofit landscape really mirrors the for-profit landscape, and they both function obviously within this larger capitalist framework. Just to kind of reiterate, and this of course results in the controlling of social movements by diverting and controlling where the money goes. And constant theme of this presentation, it places power in the hands of those who already have power and who have wealth. Again, I want to reiterate that advocacy, organizing, systems change work is not funded in this nonprofit industrial complex landscape, because the work that focuses on true and lasting equity requires a redistribution of resources, and people don't want to fund that because because the people who are able to fund things are benefiting from the current system that we live in. So why would they want to change it, right? Another thing to think about is that when you control the purse strings, you also kind of are able to control what a nonprofit does with those funds that you distribute. So in nonprofit terms, this means that a lot of nonprofits are not able to get the general operating funds that they need. Rather, the funds that they're receiving are for a specific project or program. And this is important because it again perpetuates this idea that other people, the people who are giving out the funds, who are, making the donations to these nonprofits, know better than the actual people on the ground who are doing the work. They say, well, I think that we should fund this program. Whereas, an organization might really need general operating funds to do, any number of things, pay salaries, pay general and administrative costs. They know what they need, yet they're being told what they need by somebody who is, 10 degrees away from the actual work that's being done. Okay, so just kind of going off on a little tangent here. I want to talk about a few things that underscore the nonprofit industrial complex. So systemic oppression. This is obviously a type of social injustice, and it's basically the systems that are in place that are keeping people oppressed. So there's a number of mechanisms: social norms, stereotypes, institutions, and then of course our own legislation, governmental legislation. Something that's really important to keep in mind is that systemic oppression does not necessarily need to be deliberate. It can arise from good intentions without people even realizing it. So understanding systemic oppression and how that leads to inequity and injustice is a really key first step into dismantling these systems of oppression. So nonprofits are just as susceptible to systemic oppression as for-profits. And that's kind of one of the main gists of the nonprofit industrial complex, is that, again, it mirrors the framework of the for-profit landscape. Oop. So another thing that underlies the nonprofit industrial complex is racism. And of course, this is inextricably tied to systemic oppression because racism runs through systemic oppression, of course. So just one statistic that I want to highlight here is there is a 30-year death gap between residents of Streeterville and the residents of Englewood. And what I mean by this is that life expectancy in Streeterville is 30 years higher than the life expectancy of those in Englewood. Of course, COVID-19 has exacerbated these issues and exacerbated this widening, ever widening gap. And racism, we think of nonprofits as these altruistic entities that are good, are solely good. But racism and systemic oppression run through nonprofits, just like they run through every aspect of our society. I mean, it's dismantling hundreds and hundreds of years of racism and systemic oppression is not something that's going to happen overnight. And it's not something that one type of entity can do. Further, nonprofits don't exist in a vacuum. So all of these things are tied together, the for-profit landscape, the nonprofit landscape. Therefore, it's just inevitable that the same things that run through, the government and the for-profit landscape are going to run through the nonprofit landscape. Income inequality is, of course, another big issue that underlies the nonprofit industrial complex. So there's a few statistics here, and the one that I really wanted to highlight was that for every $1 that banks loaned in Chicago's white neighborhoods, they invested just 12 cents in Black neighborhoods. Again, this shows that all of these things are intertwined and interconnected, and they can't sort of exist in a vacuum. So racism, again, is rearing its head when it comes to income inequality. So another thing that can be part of the nonprofit landscape is this white savior complex. So I'm sure you all have heard of this term, but just to kind of level set a little bit here, white savior complex is when there's an individual who feels that they need to come in, swoop in, and save another community or another individual who is less than. So it often also involves this performative aspect, making a big show of giving or helping or volunteering. So with social media, of course, there has been a huge rise in this performative white saviorism. People touting the donations that they've made or the volunteer work that they do once a year around Christmas time or what have you. And then white savior complex, of course, contributes to tokenism, which I sort of mentioned before. And tokenism is a very dangerous concept that creates a hierarchy between people. So one point that I really wanted to emphasize is that the white savior complex, you're doing things for or to others or other communities rather than empowering and amplifying those individuals and those communities to make change for their community or for themselves. So that's a really important and key point because it's again about this transfer of power. Those who have power don't want to give it up. So they hoard the power for themselves and hide behind this white saviorism and say, I'm doing a good thing. I'm giving money to this organization, but they're not allowing for that transfer of power to amplify the work that others are doing or empower communities to make change themselves. So a few just facts about the nonprofits. So nonprofits are a booming business. And I use the term business very intentionally here because, as I've mentioned a few times now, the nonprofit landscape really mirrors the for-profit landscape. And it is a booming business. It's a business, it's an industry. There are 1.54 million registered nonprofits in the US. It's a $1 trillion industry. And within Illinois alone, there are nearly 37,000 501c3s, which is the tax code for a nonprofit organization. And I titled this slide, "We're not going to nonprofit our way out of this," because that again goes back to this concept that nonprofits really shouldn't even exist the way that they do today if our government was working the way that it really should be, and if our social safety net wasn't so tattered. So a few key points about nonprofits. Over $1 trillion in philanthropy dollars is unused. Only 5% is distributed each year. So there's 95% just sitting there, like in donor advised funds or, in corporate foundations. As I mentioned before, less than 10% of philanthropic dollars goes to communities of color, and less than 3% goes to systems change, human rights, and social justice. So again, this idea that people don't want to fund advocacy or organizing work or systemic change work because they don't actually want to make change at a systems level because it's benefiting them for the systems to stay the way that they are. So why aren't nonprofits working besides the big philanthropy that we've talked about? So again, puritanical roots, this idea that there are the worthy poor versus the unworthy poor. And you can see this, for example, in the concept of welfare queens from the 1980s, from the Reagan era. These this perspective that welfare was going to welfare queens who were exploiting the system rather than going to the worthy poor. Again, goes back to big philanthropy. And then, like I've mentioned a few times now, it mirrors the private sector. So we're going to kind of discuss how it mirrors the private sector. So it's hierarchical, a top-down structure, concentrates power at the top, focuses on professionalization, systematization, and consistency. And what I mean by this is that nonprofits are run like a business. So they focus on these three things. For a nonprofit to really function as a nonprofit should, to really benefit the people, it really can't run like a business because a business is about making a profit. So while nonprofits don't make a profit, they're still accountable to their boards. They still need to be financially viable and financially successful. So the whole system just doesn't even really make sense for what a nonprofit is intended to do. And then, of course, there's this lack of representation and connection to the community. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. It comes in the form of diversity. So I'm not going to read all these facts, but private sector diversity really mirrors the nonprofit sector diversity, which is to say that there is not much diversity. So let's take a look at the nonprofit sector diversity. So 42% of organizations are led by female executive directors. So that's actually a pretty good statistic. That's, not super uneven. But then we kind of dive into this racial diversity aspect, and 90% of all executive directors or presidents of nonprofits are white. And this, of course, doesn't mirror the population breakdown of the United States. It does, however, mirror the leadership of foundations. So if you'll recall, I think it was about 89% of foundation presidents or board chairs were white as well, white men. Okay, so why this lack of diversity? Well, there's all the obvious reasons that, underscore pretty much everything in the fabric of the United States, but there's this concept of implicit bias. So recruiters and hiring boards are often biased, even if they don't intend to be. We sort of have to work really hard to challenge those implicit biases that we have. Additionally, 80% of nonprofit staff recruit from their own professional networks, and 75% of white Americans don't have any minorities in their networks. So, there you have it. It's hard to use your network. It's hard to create diversity in an organization when you're just pulling from the same pool of this, of homogenous kind of groups. So racism, oppression, systemic inequity, all of these things run through the nonprofit world as well. So they are just as susceptible to systemic oppression as for-profits and government institutions. But there is work being done, especially now, especially sort of after the racial uprisings of the summer, in nonprofits understanding how they fit into these systems of oppression, and then working to try to dismantle those systems of oppression. Now, sometimes it's just lip service. Other times it is, really meaningful changes that these organizations are trying to make. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we as individuals can kind of try to discern between those two things when we're making some of the choices that we make around philanthropy. So what can we do as individuals? The first thing we can do is to understand this landscape, to understand the systems of oppression and inequity that run through this landscape and how things are not as they seem. You can't just take a $100 million donation from a Jeff Bezos on face value. There's strings attached with it. There's tax incentives. It's not just good intentions. And even when it is good intentions, those intentions can be harmful if you don't really understand how to properly distribute those funds or use those funds. Another way that we as individuals can challenge these systems and work to dismantle them is to step aside and allow other voices to be heard and amplify those other voices. So, as a white woman, it's my responsibility to use my privilege to get out of the way and allow other people's voices to really come through, people who know better than I do. I'm not an expert on what communities of color need, but there are plenty of experts out there who, can be given more of a platform. So use your privilege to create those spaces for others to really show their expertise, and then trust in those people's expertise when you're if you're a decision maker, or if you have some kind of power, like release a little bit of that power to individuals who know better than you might. Ditch the savior complex, of course. Empower communities to make decisions themselves, to trust in them to know what they need and how best to serve their communities. So tactically speaking, what can we do? So reimagining fundraising and philanthropy is a big part of what Women Unite does. Like I said in the very beginning of the presentation, we worked really hard to make sure that our organization was built on the collective power of our community. So we don't receive giant checks from giant foundations. We are built off of, $50 donations from people like you or me. And so when you are going to make, your donations to organizations, or you're going to kind of support a cause that you really believe in, do your due diligence and look into that organization and see who's on their board, see who's making the decisions for that organization, who is on their staff, who's their leadership, what kind of support are they providing to the community? Are they working to uplift and empower the community, or are they working to just, give a man a fish kind of thing? So these are all some practical steps that we can take to challenge some of these existing systems and challenge some of these notions around what philanthropy is and how we can be part of philanthropy. So that's really it. That's all I've got. I'd love to open it up for some questions or comments. So yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tara. This was a great presentation. And we have some questions already in the chat. So just first off, there's a question about the source of the nonprofit diversity data, which leads me to say, I can't remember if we talked about this with you beforehand, but could we share your PowerPoint presentation with attendees? I mean, we've got other ways that people can look it up, but
yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've listed the sources for almost every stat, but why don't I go through and make sure that all the sources are there, and then I can share the PowerPoint with you to share with everyone, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. That would be fabulous. And then a question about what role do you think new models like social entrepreneurship and impact investing plays in this landscape and addressing the inequities and whatnot that you have laid out for us?
So that's a great question. So let me ask, with social entrepreneurship, are you sort of referring to social like enterprises where the individuals in the community are part of the leadership and part of those benefiting financially from the endeavor, from the business endeavor? Just a point of clarification.
I'll let there you go, Kruti.
Yeah, hi. Yes, part of social enterprise is that, but also like this model where like profit is not the only motive, right? Purpose is also a motive. And I'm wondering if, you know, in your research and your deep dive into this landscape, this trend of this being seen as a solution has come about. If you know, like where does it fit, or is it something entirely different? Just sort of curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that I'm not too much of an expert in this realm, but from the, you know, cursory knowledge that I do have, and from my own personal experience, actually, I think it's a really slippery slope. Again, I think it's kind of, you have these very good, noble intentions of transferring power from one group to another, but anything like a business is still a business, you know? And so you're again accountable to these systems of capitalism that drive business. So while there is, of course, like an altruistic and a beneficial component to social entrepreneurship and social enterprises, it's still very, I think, difficult to really separate that from an actual for-profit, you know, the way that a for-profit business runs, because you are still, again, accountable generally to a board or to, you know, the financial imperatives of the business. So even if those financial outcomes are benefiting the community, it can often exploit the community in a way as well. It can exploit the people who are within the business or within, you know, the system of entrepreneurship. But I think it's a really great question, and I think there's a lot of current research being done around this because it is a newer sort of realm and a newer model, as you mentioned. So I would love to delve deeper into that.
Thanks. Savina, you have a great comment and question. Rather than, excuse me, in part because I'm apparently losing my voice, rather than my reading it from the chat, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure, absolutely. Can everyone hear me, by the way? I'm not using headphones.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So first, I just wanted to thank Tara for this wonderful and important presentation. A lot of this presentation really resonated with me because in my current project, am looking at the less sanguine effects of multiple US foundations on the welfare state in post-colonial India. So I study the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. So I just wanted to say thank you for this because a lot of this sort of resonated with me and touched on things that I've been working on. I also wanted to quickly mention that I really appreciated your linking of the argument about the NPIC with the British Poor Laws. It really sort of reminded me of recent work in history that is basically arguing that the reinvention of the rise of neoliberal capitalism today is basically a reinvention of the British Poor Laws. So I really, really appreciated that connection. So my question is such. So as we know, this is a private school, right? And it's one that generates a lot of student debt. In fact, every semester I have at least one or two students that come to my office hours and talk to me about how anxious they're feeling about graduating soon and having to pay back student debt, right? And not just that, it also depends on private giving too, right? For advancement, we have a foundations and a corporate relations organization on campus that is trying to really add to that, right? Add to the pot of money here. And so given that, I just was interested in what you think about your own recommendations about how to further this kind of conversation here at Loyola. And I mean, I find that I do stitch some of these conversations into the classes that I teach, especially those that are about power and society. But I find that the conversation just sort of stops there. And forums like this are really great for having those conversations. But I was wondering if you had any other sort of advice and recommendations for how to really further this kind of thinking, this kind of critical thinking. Thank you.
Sure. So I actually have quite a bit of personal experience with the university giving system, because that's where I got my start. So I worked in fundraising for a university here in Chicago, and my solution to furthering that conversation or kind of making a stand was to quit my job. No, I'm kidding. I mean, I did quit my job, but so, I found it very challenging to work in a system like that because it felt so disingenuous isn't quite the right word, but it felt very self-serving to some kind of higher entity. So not even self-serving necessarily for the students, but self-serving for the institution as a whole. And I always questioned, like, well, we're raising billions of dollars, and yes, that goes to better spaces for the students, scholarships, what have you. But there's also, I think a good example of sort of what's really going on here is endowment funds. Endowments are one of those things that I just, I've never understood why an endowment needs to be, $30 billion, however much it is, look at like Chicago has obviously a huge endowment. And I know it's sort of like a rainy day fund, but, when is that rainy day? Is today that rainy day when we have students who are coming into your office who can't, who are anxious and nervous about the fact that they can't pay for an education. So all this is to say that I think challenging these systems in a university is incredibly difficult. One thing that I would say, one place where I think individuals have a bit of power when it comes to trying to stir up these conversations and have these conversations is, you are an individual donor, and you, as part of the university and part of your own sort of alma mater, can ask these kinds of questions, of individuals who are doing the fundraising and say, well, how much of my dollar is going to scholarships? How much of my dollar is going to X, Y, and Z? And bring up these conversations because, they want your donations, and not just because of the, $25 or however much you want to donate, but because each individual donor contributes to one of the criteria for how universities get ranked by US News and World Report, which was something that I didn't know when I first started working in the university field. But each individual donor, alumni donor, helps that ranking score go up. So, and I'm not suggesting, if you want to donate to your university, that's great. But, ask these questions. Again, do your due diligence. Where's my money going? How much of it is going to, something that's not benefiting students? Or, what is the university doing to alleviate some of the struggles that students are facing? What is the university doing to give scholarships to, people of color? So I think it's just about asking a lot of questions and kind of putting people on the spot.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Christine, and then I'll invite our colleague Diana Hackbarth to unmute and join into the conversation. Christine?
All right. So I'm wondering on a couple of things. First of all, the model that you've been talking about is basically still a charity model and a business model. And I'm wondering more, using another model, which is a membership model, and community boards rather than business professional boards, because I think that this is my shtick, but I think that the whole focus of nonprofits in a lot of ways are undemocratic. I mean, the people on the board aren't really from the community. I mean, very well-meaning. I'm not saying any of those things, but we've gotten to rely too much on them as a way that social service and community organizations function. So I think that that's another model, and using co-ops, using the model of unions, associations. There's a whole bunch of negatives or problems with that, but that's one kind of thing. And the other, since I have it on my stool, so to speak, that I think another thing to think of in terms of university funding, besides having public universities and stuff like that, is also to have a much stronger public scholarship aspect to it. I mean, for example, in Scandinavian countries, you basically have a pot of money for university. And if you don't go to a university, if you don't go to the public university, you can use that pot of money to go to a private university or a university in another country. So I'm just saying it's sort of like having more citizens' rights for education and sort of strengthening the public model for delivery of services and delivery of benefits, and then having the nonprofit and community model being much more for mobilization, advocacy, and empowerment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. A couple of things regarding your second point. I think this again, that would be the ideal, obviously, but I think this again goes back to our systems are somewhat broken. The government is not able to provide the things that the people need. And we have trillions of dollars going to the military, and how much of it is going to public education, or how much of it is going to creating a pot, as you mentioned, that they do like in Scandinavia. So it's, our priorities, that's one of the problems. What are our priorities? They're totally, in my opinion, skewed. So, oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute. Still on mute.
Maybe it was smart and put me on mute. But there's just one more thing. My generation, which is the 60s generation, that John Judas wrote this really interesting article many, many years ago, in which he said so many of my generation who were well-meaning went into the nonprofit world, went into that model. And he said, rather than staying in an organizing public service in the public sector model and in unions and stuff like that. And he talked about how that was taking a lot of energy in building an undemocratic system. And so it's in some ways, I think right now with this interest, thank God, in public service again, in some ways, is people taking that energy to also go back into not only, advocate for things, but actually start to be elected, represent, and change those systems. I know that's a long-term thing, and I think this isn't a counterpose to what you were suggesting, but I think it's part of the context.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with that. And I think that there has been this resurgence of interest in public advocacy work. And it is obviously a very long-term thing. No change is going to happen overnight. But I do feel, especially like with local politics, that things are moving in a direction that is better than where we're at now. So I feel hopeful about that. As to your very first question or comment about the boards, I could not agree more that I think that the board structure that exists for nonprofits right now is absurd. And I know that part of it is because a major, if not the most important thing that a board does right now is fundraise through their own funds and then through their networks. So if you don't have wealthy individuals on your board, you're missing out on a huge chunk of your fundraising dollars. Almost every board that I've ever worked with or come into contact with has a give or get policy where they either have to give, $5,000, $10,000 or get that same amount of money from their networks. A lot of boards also have that. And additionally, they have a required donation to an endowment for the nonprofit. So, representation on the board from individuals within the community and those who are experts is so important. But oftentimes those individuals don't have the ability to give or get $5,000, $10,000, whatever the requirement is. And then the other thing is that, while I like the sort of association, like co-op model, back to the idea that, individuals from these communities can't, don't have the means to be on boards. A lot of times they don't even have the means to, pay a due, the dues to be part of those entities. So it's a really challenging thing. And I don't have the answers. And I don't know how, I wish I knew how we could kind of break this cycle. I just, on a personal note, I left a for-profit company to work in the nonprofit landscape because I was like, I want to do something good. I want to, make change. And I very quickly became disillusioned with it. So it's one of those things where you have, again, like these good intentions and you think you're going to really help people. And in many ways you are, but you see how much more deeply rooted these issues are. And that, just because you're, providing meals during COVID doesn't mean that that's going to result in any long-term change. And that's a really hard thing to reconcile.
Thank you, Tara. Diana, you can feel free to not take the spotlight, but I'll turn over to you to kind of reflect from your experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you. First of all, this is a very interesting and provocative presentation. And part of me absolutely agrees because I've been going back and forth on this for 50 years. And the other part of me, has disagreements. One thing I will say is that there are some big philanthropies that do give to advocacy organizations. So I can just share with you, Robert Wood Johnson is the one who gave, I was part of that, $1 million when I was on the board with Respiratory Health Association and Heart Association to do anti-tobacco advocacy. And I'm the vice chair of the Illinois Coalition Against Tobacco. And we made Chicago smoke-free. We made the state smoke-free. We did all that because the Robert Wood Johnson money said we were not allowed to do direct services and do smoking cessation. We had to do policy and advocacy. So, and I think there's, in healthcare, there's plenty of examples from Kaiser Family Foundation and others where you're not allowed to do direct services. You have to do advocacy and system-wide change. On the other hand, Robert Wood Johnson won't let you lobby. So you have to use a different pile to lobby, but you can do the education. So I'll say that. The other thing, and I guess the good Diana thinks you're absolutely right. We should really look for the expertise in the community. And bad Diana has looked for expertise in the community for 50 years. And sometimes you get really good feedback and things can go well. And sometimes the people in the community don't know what to do either. And I have been like to meetings that go on and on and on for 2 or 3 years and nothing happens because the community doesn't have the capacity. So I guess I'm maybe equally applaud community expertise and equally skeptical of community expertise as I am from expert expertise. So, and like I said, and then the last thing I'll say is I'm so old, I can't go to a meeting that lasts till midnight where nothing happens anymore. So
I feel the same way.
okay, so you've been to that too.
I've been to many of those, but like you said, I've been to meetings like that where you have members of the community, but also I've been to meetings like that where you have the experts. And one thing I would say is that this again, I feel like it's just so I feel like just a broken record here, but a lot of times I think individuals who are in the community who we want to kind of uplift them and empower them and give them a seat at the table essentially, they haven't received the education to be able to do that kind of work. And that again goes back to this idea of our government isn't providing the social safety net that we need and the social services that we need. So, if we were to train people on how a nonprofit works or how they can contribute to the driving an organization, who knows what the outcomes would be. Those people might be much better equipped to contribute to making change and driving an organization. But again, it's a huge failing on all of the different systems.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, so, so I'm sort of back because I always work with high school kids lately, like, let's start young and give people the skill set so that they can take over so we don't have to. That's what I would like. But as I said, I mean, if we don't have time, I could give you stories of all the money that's been wasted by organizations where like this Illinois legislature, gives everybody $100,000, but they don't know what to do with it. So duh.
Yeah.
So.
And to your point about the organizing, the foundations that do give to organizing, I certainly didn't mean to insinuate that there were none, but they are fewer and farther between, definitely. Right. There are some great ones that do, and I applaud those organizations because that is really that's where the work needs to happen. But it's mostly direct service that gets funded.
Thank you, Diana. Emily Jones, question from you.
Hi, yes. So I'm a Master's of Social Work student right now, and I feel like this is a conversation that I've had in multiple of my classes about how the nonprofit structure is flawed and how it doesn't, do a good job of providing services. And yet, as a social work student, you're still expected to play this role within this system. And kind of expected just to, acknowledge the issues within it, but continue to do the work. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, how people in these service position roles can kind of challenge the system, if there is a way of doing that, or if you just have any thoughts or ideas about, how social work can help challenge this structure.
Yeah, that's a great question. But because I also have a very intimate knowledge of social work. I have a brother who is developmentally disabled. And so I've been navigating the labyrinthine social services, system for many, many years now. I think, and this goes back to, I believe it was Christine's point. I think the best way to kind of challenge these systems is through public policy advocacy. That really is the best way to do it. You as an individual working in, working as a social worker, I honestly, I'll be quite frank with you. I really don't know as an individual how you would challenge those systems you could challenge them by asking questions of superiors and things like that and kind of, again, putting them on the spot, but that's not really going to affect change, right? Really the only way to affect change in these systems is to advocate for, policies that are going to change the systems for the better. I will say, just for on a personal level, I think it's really, I feel like this is a public service announcement, but burnout in that industry is like no other I've seen. So it's really important when you're in the nonprofit realm or in the social services realm to take care of yourself and to kind of step away and take some breaks, because, you know, people, I think, just burn out after just a couple of years. I mean, I've seen it firsthand many, many times. And the other thing is to celebrate the wins that you do get, because you will, you know, there are wins in this system. You know, there are some wins, and we need to, you know, yes, we need to challenge and we need to push and we need to kind of move things forward and kind of try to dismantle these systems. But at the same time, like, let's not sort of denigrate the wins that we do have, because those change lives. I mean, I've experienced it firsthand with my brother. You know, just today, I got a call from his caseworker and said that we qualified for a second level of assistance, which was, you know, huge. And I didn't think it was going to happen. And that's a huge win for our family. So just remember that you are helping individuals, even if the system is broken or flawed, it still does help some people.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I think that's one of the things that has really kept me going through this like disillusionment that I've been having recently, is that, you know, service provision is all that we have right now. And until we can imagine a different system, you know, working within that and helping people is still beneficial.
Absolutely. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you can do those things in parallel with each other. So you can work within the system, but also work to change the system all at the same time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure.
That's a great segue to Kit's question. Kit, do you want to unmute and give voice to your question?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, Tara, thanks so much for this presentation. I feel like you already started touching on the question with Diana earlier, but I've worked for a couple of larger nonprofits in my career, and we're always talking about, you know, elevating the voice of those we serve. And I'm just wondering if you've seen anyone doing a really good job of it. Like, what is an effective way to actually accomplish it, you know, and get around some of the challenges that you were just discussing?
I think loosening requirements around fundraising is the biggest thing that I would say. And I have seen some organizations doing a really good job of it. Actually, so one of the organizations that is one of our Women Unites clients, I Grow Chicago, they have mostly a traditional board of, you know, people who work at corporations, you know, who want to do good and have good intentions and you know, help the organization, but they also have members of the community on their board, and they don't have the same give or get restrictions on those community members, because they recognize that those community members are bringing something just as valuable, if not more valuable, to the table than the funds that others are bringing in. So, you know, it's amazing because people are like, well, that's not fair. That's not equitable, because we're asking a certain group of people to give money, and then we're not asking another group. We're asking another group we're not asking another group of people to give money. But I counter that with, well, their circumstances aren't equitable. So, you know, why are we kind of tied down by this like false ideal of, you know, equitable, you know, distribution of responsibilities when, you know, it's not equitable to begin with. And one person brings, you know, something to the table and another person brings something else to the table, and that's fine. You know, let's be okay with that. So I think really the biggest thing is loosening of restrictions. And also, and this is a tougher thing than loosening of restrictions, but shifting your mentality around having, you know, community members on the board. And I think that's really challenging to do, because it's human nature to kind of think that you are an expert in something, and you are probably you are an expert in something, you know, inevitably, but allowing other people's voices who might not be as traditionally educated as you are, you know, to amplifying those voices, uplifting those voices, is I think a difficult thing to do. Also, a lot of times I think what's challenging is that community members who are on boards will push back on traditional like solutions to serving those communities and be like, this doesn't work. And, you know, a lot of leadership of nonprofits, they don't want to hear that something isn't something that they has been tried and true for them, you know, tried and true is not working. So I think it's really, I think the changing your mindset around the expertise that a community member can bring is really the most challenging thing. Much more challenging, like I said, than loosening restrictions. But I think some of the things that I've been seeing lately, and I think I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but there are some organizations who are really working to become more equitable and inclusive, like, and doing, you know, certain things like equity audits, making sure that the organization is really kind of putting their money where their mouth is around equity. I've been seeing more and more of that, and I've been seeing a lot of organizations doing that beyond just the kind of pretense of doing it. So I feel like this is a moment where things are shifting, and I just hope that this moment lasts, because, you know, the farther we get away from the racial uprisings and everything that happened with, you know, the police killings, like, I think I can sort of see the momentum slowing, and that worries me a little bit. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't know that there is a very clear or solid answer.
I think that's the challenge, is that there is no silver bullet here.
No, there isn't. There really isn't. And there isn't with any of the things that we've talked about today.
Which is an interesting segue then to Taylor's question. Taylor, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, hello. Thank you, David. And thank you, Tara, for this presentation. So my question is really centered on furthering change, right? And are there, considering that, are there any by POC-led philanthropic organizations that you're aware of that folks aren't necessarily moving towards as much as they should be, things like that?
You mean like within the Chicagoland area?
Yeah, in the Chicagoland area, or just nationally.
So I'm not super well versed in what is going on nationally in like the nonprofit, like I just, there's so much out there. I mean, so many nonprofits out there that I just don't really keep up with other organizations outside of Chicago as much, because my work is so rooted in Chicago. But absolutely, there are a lot of really wonderful BIPOC-led organizations in Chicago, and a lot of them can be found in the communities that are, you know, primarily communities of color. So like one of the ones that I always point to that I think really does a really good job is My Block, My Hood, My City. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, but it's a really fantastic organization, and they do a lot of really amazing work in the community. Another one that's actually very organizing and advocacy based is Assata's Daughters. They're another great one as well. One of our organizations, Healing to Action, the one that works with gender justice and gender-based violence, is led by two women who are women of color. And their board is also made up of a lot of mostly women and you know, I think about half women of color. So there's a lot out there. I would highly recommend kind of doing the homework of finding these organizations, because there are so many nonprofits out there, but there are a lot of ways to hone in on which ones are doing the kind of work that resonates with you, and, you know, having the kind of leadership that really furthers, you know, equity and inclusion and diversity. And a really great way to do that is to actually reach out to some of these nonprofits, you know, that you do know of, and say, hey, like, who are some of the partners that you work with? Who are some of the other entities that you work with? I'd like to kind of get to know a little bit more about your work and how that's part of like a larger coalition or a larger community of organizations that are BIPOC led or doing that kind of work.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Forgive me right off the bat, I think I might mispronounce your name. Dana, you have a question about the 501c3? Sorry.
No problem. Hi, I'm Dina Al-Khatib, and thank you, Tara. This is great. I've worked in the nonprofit sector, including on the philanthropic side for a little while, for a long time. And I feel like everything you're saying is very right on. One question I had is, and I think this is a double-edged sword, but would it be helpful to remove lobbying restrictions for 501c3s? And I know from experience that even though are ways to do advocacy and education as a 501c3, many 501c3s shy away from that because there's such a fine line between that and lobbying, and they don't want to risk their status.
Right.
And I appreciate Diane's response about being part of an advocacy group, but sometimes then you got to get the advocacy group to be advocating for what you want it to be advocating for.
Start your own advocacy group.
Right, yeah.
To your question about lobbying, I will say I don't know as much about lobbying, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But like you said, I very much agree that it is kind of a double-edged sword, because while on one hand, I think removing lobbying restrictions would kind of help with some of that systemic change and advocacy work that needs to happen. On the other hand, I think there's so many other inherent problems with nonprofits and like, for example, like the leader, like we've been talking about the leadership, not being representative of the community, that I think, it could be, and I know I used this phrase earlier, but it could be a slippery slope of people advocating for things that aren't really beneficial to the community and are more sort of their own personal agenda or the agenda of the board or the leadership. So I think it can be kind of dangerous. And, it might be one of those things where you remove the restriction, but then have a few other restrictions put into place. Although I don't even know what that would look like, to be honest. So I think it could be kind of dangerous in a way, depending on, I would much rather see restrictions put in place around what a board makeup would be. And actually a lot of funders are now requiring, boards to be, X% BIPOC or, so, which actually presents its own other set of problems. So, I mean, it's just like this constant cycle of issues. So it's a very tricky nut to crack.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting when the funders do it, put that onus on the organizations they're funding, but they don't do it themselves too, which is
that's
issue.
Part of the issue as well. And also just, yeah, there's a lot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tara, thank you. It's 12:02 and I want to be respectful of people's time. I will note that there are some Kit and Kaya made some great observations about the fact that 501c3s can lobby. It's a certain percentage of your budget. And then a great list of other organizations like Brave Space Alliance and Chicago Black Drag Council and the Chicago Community Board Fund are also great BIPOC organizations.
Rage in Englewood is another really good one. Rage.
Yes. Yeah. So thank you to Tara. Thank you so much. Clearly people were not interested in this because we just had to drag questions out of folks. No, but seriously, thank you. This was a great conversation, a great presentation, and we very much appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. So
I'm couldn't be more honored, and I just thank you everyone for watching and for your amazing questions. And I hope that this was somewhat illuminating and somewhat thought-provoking. So I know that I have a lot to think about with the amazing questions and conversation that we had.